Well, hello, everybody. I know it takes a little bit of time for the Zoom webinar to fill up. So come in, help yourself to a drink, take a seat, and thank you very much for joining us for our fourth Pop Conversation. As I can see, I can still see the numbers ticking up nicely. So come in and take a seat. Before I introduce our star guest and speaker, let me just go through a few housekeeping points. These will be obvious to you if you've previously joined us for a Pop Conversation, but can always be reminded of them. If you want to ask our speaker a question, please put that in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, in the Q&A box. And I will take as many questions as I can from there. I can see we've already got one from Andy Beckett. And if you're far too shy to ask a question yourself, don't worry, you can have a look in the Q&A box and you can give the thumbs up to the questions that you'd like me to put to Robert. And being a very democratic sort of guy, I will lean towards picking those that are at the top of the poll, and I'll do my best to get through as many of them as possible. If you open the chat box, don't put your questions in there, but we'll be sending links to various things that might be of interest to you, not least a recent think tank paper by our guest speaker today. So I think those are the bits and bobs you need. I should say that this is being recorded. It's not being streamed live anywhere other than here, but it is being recorded. If you are a journalist and want any segments of it, please email us via the Popular Conservatism website for permission, but mainly for the benefit of our speaker. Everything is on the record, and you can also use the React button at the bottom of your screen to indicate your agreement, love, or applause of whatever might be said by myself or our speaker. So I think those are all the bits and bobs that I need to appraise you with. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Robert Jenrick MP to this fourth Pop Conversation. Robert is, of course, former housing minister, former health minister, I think, and most recently former immigration minister, where he resigned because he didn't think that government policy was actually getting to grips with the problem. Far from scurrying off to the backbenches and licking his wounds, he is now a leading personality in public debate, particularly about immigration. I'm going to focus quite a bit on our discussion with on that topic, but we'll go much wider than that as the hour progresses. Robert, absolutely great to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us. How the devil are you doing, sir?
Oh, well, good evening, Mark, and thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be part of this and to support you and PopCon and everything that you're trying to do for the future of conservatism.
Well, thank you, Robert. Let's start with your recent paper published by our friends at the Centre for Policy Studies. So this was about the quantum of legal immigration. Oftentimes, all of the discussion seems to be sort of focusing on the small boats and the Rwanda plan, but you're talking about the quantum of legal immigration. Give us a short sketch of the scale of this and what you think the problem might be in present public policy.
Well, when I resigned from Cabinet at the end of last year, it was most prominently because of the Rwanda policy, where I felt that the government was not pursuing a sufficiently robust version to create the deterrent that was required to fix the problem once and for all. But it was also about legal migration. And in many respects, I felt this was more important to the country and to the public because the numbers are just so much larger and the impact is so much broader. It affects many of the things that you and I care about, whether that be the housing crisis, where the numbers of people coming across now having a very significant effect on the ability of young people to get on the housing ladder. It affects the kind of country we are, how easy it is to integrate people and build a genuinely cohesive society. It affects our access to public services and our ability to finance them sustainably in the years ahead. And it affects our economy. And what I wanted to do with the Centre for Policy Studies and Neil O'Brien was to look in particular at that last question and try to assess the data and debunk the common myth, I think, that unalloyed good is large quantities of legal migration. And to put it in context, in the 25 years to 1997, net migration to this country was 68,000. In the 25 years since 1997, it has been 5.9 million. And so these are very, very large numbers. They're unprecedented in the history of this country. And I think that if you look at the data, they've really had a detrimental impact upon this country, in particular upon the economy. And we've seen that it's been a contributing factor to the low productivity growth that we've experienced in recent years and the low GDP per capita growth. In fact, the flatlining, falling GDP per capita that we've experienced over the course of the last 2 years in particular. And this is most pronounced in the last 2 years. It's not exclusively the last 2 or 3 years, but it's most pronounced post-Brexit, where we as Conservatives promised that we would control and reduce the levels of legal migration, only in fact to produce a system which is more liberal in many respects than the one that we had when we were part of the European Union. And not just that the numbers were higher, but actually we were much less selective in the types of people that we brought into the country. And so the central argument that we make in the paper is that we should make good on the promises that we and other parties have been making, frankly, throughout my entire adult life, to control and to reduce legal migration, bring it back down to the tens of thousands, which is much clearer to the historic norms that we've had as a country. But in doing so, we should be highly selective about who comes to this country and set out to have a proper guiding philosophy, which I think should be that the UK is the grammar school of the Western world, where we do genuinely seek out the best and the brightest, and we bring in those people who will make the greatest contribution to our country, and in particular, will be net contributors to our economy.
Okay. Let's unparcel some of these things, Robert, bit by bit. The sort of the quantum, the speed. It's a huge number every year. The impact on fiscal policy, the impact on GDP, the impact on GDP per capita. Let me try and unparcel some of those. So, although you've pointed out that higher immigration is not an unalloyed good or benefit, even if that has been the conventional wisdom for much of the past quarter of a century or so. Population growth is generally associated with a growing economy. I mean, I flick back to the numbers between England in 1870 to 1900, you might sort of say, at the peak of our, I don't know what economic growth was over that period, but we would be envious of it today, right? And I think population went from 30 million to 40 million over that period of time. I mean, not migration. I assume that's population growth, higher birth rates and the rest. Generally speaking, a higher population seems to be associated with a growing economy. Do you think that's right? Is it the sheer quantum, or is it can you imagine a Britain in future that does have 100 million citizens in it? Not next year or the year after, but, I don't know, in 2080, 2090, 2100. You don't have in mind some optimum population for the United Kingdom forevermore, do you?
I don't. I don't think that it is sensible to grow the economy, to grow the population substantially more than it is today, because the pressure on housing, on public services, on our sense of unity and cohesion as a country, I think is already very great and would be tested to the limits if we were to set out to bring in substantially more people into the country. We are, at the end of the day, a relatively small set of islands. And I don't think it's possible for us to house, to serve, and to integrate the kinds of numbers of people that we've seen in recent years. So I think as a matter of policy, we shouldn't be setting out to grow the population significantly. I just don't think that's possible. But I think where we are bringing people in from overseas, and as you say, the countries like ours have always had immigration, and I'm not anti-immigration per se. I think we've got to be much more careful and selective about who we bring into the country. And in fact, if you look back over our entire history, immigration policy has been very ad hoc in this country. People have come at different times for different reasons. Sometimes it's been a great success, and we can reach to examples like Ugandan Asians who came and made a massive contribution to the country. Other times it's been less successful. I would argue that in recent years, what we've seen is a big increase in low-skilled, low-wage migration, where the majority of people have been net costs to the exchequer. And that's not sustainable. If you want to live in a country which has an extremely generous welfare state like we have with an NHS, where we also have, are in the midst of a housing crisis, I just don't think that can continue. And so the guiding philosophy for our immigration system in the years and decades ahead has to be one of trying to be very selective and, for the first time in our modern history, think very carefully about who comes to this country and choose people as far as one can, and it's not a precise art, who are going to make an economic contribution.
Okay, let me push back a little bit on this. I warned you before we went live, Robert, that I might play a bit of devil's advocate. But an argument that I suppose I'm quite attracted to as a free market kind of person is when we list all of the things that can't cope with this growing population, or hundreds of thousands of people coming in. The NHS can't cope, the transport infrastructure, the housing market, the schools, the National Health Service, all of the rest of it. You'll notice all of these things have something in common. They're all things run by the government. I've never heard Tesco's complaining that too many people are trying to buy groceries, or a pub complaining that too many people are trying to buy, beer. But is it, could we not have an approach that sort of says, and you're right, government is very expensive in this country, in my view, far too expensive. But what about this sort of approach? I'm oversimplifying it just to give you a sense of my thinking. But if you were to divide the entire cost of government in the UK with the number of people in the country, it would come out at about £14,000 per person per head. Now, obviously, that is a gross oversimplification, because if you're sick, you cost more than somebody who's healthy. If you're elderly or very young, you might be in education. So it's a very, very, very raw average. But as a sort of starting point, shouldn't that, if you like, be the membership fee? But generally speaking, if you're handing over more than £14,000 in tax, all things being equal, you are a net contributor. And the National Health Service and the transport network and all of the rest of it will be benefiting from the fact that you will be paying at least as much in tax as you're taking in public services. Do you think that's a sensible way of beginning to address the issue? So come over and be a student if you want, but if you want to bring your spouse and 2 kids, we're going to have to charge you £14,000 per person per year. You can offset it against your income tax, but that's the price of government. And were we to sort of charge people that, say, an oversimplified membership fee, don't much of these issues about things being under strain disappear, because the Exchequer will have much more funding?
Well, I think there's some truth in what you say, and that's part of the more honest debate that I'm trying to encourage on immigration, where we actually have better command of the facts, because at the moment data is extremely poor in this area, and decisions have been historically made in quite an ad hoc manner. And we try to create a selective system where at the heart of it is what kind of economic contribution people are going to make to the country. That was one of the reasons why I set out to persuade the Prime Minister at the end of last year successfully to increase the salary threshold, so that if you come on a skilled visa, a work visa, you have to earn at least £38,000 a year, so that by and large, those people will be net contributors to the UK. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's quite as simple as that, because some of our stocks of infrastructure are not easily replenished. Mm-hmm. You don't come to the UK with a mile of road, a hospital bed, a home built, and those things cost a lot of money, and in this country take a lot of time to build as well. I share your frustration that the state is poor at responding to increased demand and building hospitals, building roads, building or allowing more homes to be built through our sclerotic planning system. And those are things that I have campaigned on in the past to be improved. But even then, there are limits to what is feasible. If you look at the number of people who've come into the country legally in the last year, you'd have to be building a new home every 5 minutes, day and night, just to build enough homes to house those new arrivals for England alone. And that isn't practical. There's no time in our history where we've been building that many homes, even when we had a less regulated planning system before the Town and Country Planning Act. So even then, I think you have to be realistic about our ability to welcome new arrivals. And then lastly, there is an element to this question which is not about the economy, and that is about what kind of country we want to create. And I think if you have 1.2 million people coming in, as we did last year, it's very hard, if not impossible, to successfully integrate those people. And that goes beyond the economics and just to the question of, do we want to have a country with a sense of national community?
Yeah.
And I think we do. And therefore, you have to put limits upon the number of people coming in any given year.
I read your and Neil O'Brien's report, and I say we've linked to it in the chat for those of you who haven't read it yet, along with your brilliant 4-minute video with Neil O'Brien as well. We've linked to that in the chat as well. And there's some fascinating observations you make in the data, comparing the likelihood to be in work of immigrants from a range of different countries and the likely earnings of immigrants from each of the countries. You'll have them top of mind now, but I remember you comparing, I can't remember, Spanish to Somalian, and then Kiwis and Canadians, or Singaporeans to Spaniards. Do you think there's any case, and somebody's asked, Sam Anderson's asked in the Q&A, what happened to the point system promised by Gove and Johnson, and why was Boris so casual about immigration? But do you think there's a case for having different immigration policies according to these national metrics? That if the Kiwis and the Singaporeans tend to be very high earners, then if you're coming from that country, we might be a bit more open doors to you. But if you're coming from a country which has a record of, not entering the labour market or not being a high earner, that might count against you. So should nationality be one of the considerations when we're looking at whether to grant you a visa or permanent leave to remain or the rest of it? Or should it just be a point system? Are you one of the 30,000 health workers that we need? Or do you think we should have a nation by nation, slightly different rules, a list of more approved countries and a list of rather less approved countries?
Well, to the first question, we never created a system which was either Australian or points-based. In fact, as I've argued repeatedly, in many respects, we betrayed the promise of Brexit by creating a system which was entirely different to the one that was sold to the British public during and immediately after the referendum. I think the people who made those decisions made some quite serious errors. I don't think that it is practical to create a system based on nationality, although I can see arguments for it. As you say, the data, such that we have, suggests very wide variances between different nationalities, whether that's in the likelihood to live in social housing, to the kind of economic contribution they're making to the country, the likelihood to commit crime. And it is very important that we know that data and use it to inform policymaking. But I think it would be very hard to create a system whereby we were choosing by nationality. What I've suggested instead is just to make the entire system much more selective than the one that we have today. And so we raise the bar across the board and ask much more of everyone who comes into this country, whether that's salary thresholds or the information that we're asking of people to verify that they actually do have jobs and are bona fide, that they really do speak English to the required standard. I do think there's a case, and this is something I set in train when I was in the Home Office, to have a much greater risk-based approach to granting visas, whether that's for people who come here for sustained periods or just as visitors to the UK. That, I think, can be done by nationality, because it's perfectly reasonable to be asking more questions to people who are coming from countries where the data suggests that they're more likely to be non-compliant or serious problems. But I don't think I would advocate a system. I wouldn't advocate a system based on nationality, because I think that's too crude.
Now, let me dig into the sort of things that we should be measuring then, because you measure a whole vast range of different metrics in your report, all of which seem sensible to me. Fortunately, you push back on people just measuring GDP in total. That's ludicrous. I mean, clearly, if your population doubles, GDP is bound to go up, right? I mean, unless all of the new entrants have literally a productivity of 0. But you then suggest GDP per capita, which might be the best we can do. But is that really the best we can do? I mean, again, I'll oversimplify to make the point, but if we had an influx of people who perhaps aren't at the higher skilled end of the spectrum, but are doing secretarial jobs, housekeepers, I don't know, everybody has their own butler or some such like, and imagine that these people are earning a bit less than the average wage, then GDP per capita falls. But those of us who were here before these new entrants still benefit. Shouldn't we be trying to measure the GDP per capita, if you like, of the people who are presently in these islands? And if people come in, even if GDP per capita falls in aggregate, it might be for those of us who are the indigenous population already here, it's still an economic benefit. It's not just brain surgeons and Premier League footballers coming in, actually some fruit pickers and some secretaries and you know, some people to tarmac the roads. I mean, these people can be pretty valuable as well, even if they're below average wages, right? Who's to say it's brain surgeons that we need rather than fruit pickers?
Mm. I mean, I think the problem with that argument is that there's 9 million economically inactive people in this country, and there's almost 1 million people who are on some form of out of work benefits as well. And so my first response in the present situation would be, we've got to focus on getting those people, particularly those on benefits, off benefits and into the workplace, and we've got to tempt some of those people who are economically inactive back into the workplace. And that should be the primary focus of government. Now, it's not always as simple as that. And there are some exceptions that I'm open to us making. I'm not proposing that we cancel our seasonal agricultural workers scheme, for example. We've always had seasonal agricultural workers in this country for as long as anyone can remember. And it's perfectly sensible for people to come in for short periods to do specific tasks like that. But I don't think the shortage occupation list and the success that the government's proposed has been a success. That's generally allowed businesses to pull on the easy lever of foreign labour to come into the country rather than investing in the domestic population, skilling people up, getting people into those areas of employment, and has equally allowed universities, technical colleges, and so on to continue to focus on courses which don't directly support the domestic economy. To give you an example, in house building, there's been a massive shortage for many years of skilled people, whether that's bricklayers, plumbers, construction workers of all kinds. And the industry has focused, I think, far too much on bringing people in from overseas rather than getting our own population to skill up and enter those areas of employment. And in a constituency like mine, where we have a construction skills school, there's huge demand from young people to go into those relatively well-paid occupations. And so I think that is much more important, that we actually align our immigration policy with skill shortages in the country, and we get people into those careers rather than simply relying on foreign labour to come in. And I think for some sections of the economy, Mark, this has contributed to low productivity, where you've seen businesses which could be taking on new technologies, and that's just going to increase, accelerate in the years ahead with artificial intelligence and robotics. Some businesses have just been able to avoid that.
I think you give the example of automated car washes, don't you? That's actually sort of gone backwards, hardly high tech, but nevertheless, that's gone backwards, suggesting that lower skilled labour is
That's right. That's right. And there are other examples as well in food production, for example. There are plenty of businesses which relied on particularly Eastern European labour for a long time, and then post-Brexit have had to go further afield, when those businesses could and should be embracing new technology in a way they just haven't in recent years.
Now, you mentioned, Robert, yourself and Neil, this arbitrary target of, what is it, 600,000 a year target for the number of international students. You suggest ending that arbitrary target. But Christopher Marshall asks, shouldn't foreign students here be actually seen as a kind of valuable, invisible export? That we are selling British universities to people all over the world. Many thousands of people, come here to learn English. Aren't you potentially in your immigration policy dampening or limiting this highly successful export industry? I think it was you who said that you worry a bit that universities are more in the immigration business and education business these days. But what's your view on that? This is a great export for the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I think the UK has a fantastic education and university sector, and that's something we want to foster and encourage. It's one of the things that the UK does best. However, I think that it has grown enormously in recent years, and that has been partly fueled by the visa system that we put in place, the graduate route, which has encouraged people to come into the UK. And I would argue, and I think the data backs this up, that far from attracting the brightest and the best, this has led to a huge increase in the number of short courses of questionable quality at lower tier universities, where those universities are essentially selling access to the UK and our labour market rather than the quality and rigour of their own university course. And I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing for the country. And I don't think it's a particularly good thing for those universities either, because I'd much rather they were focused on doing really high quality courses, research, and serving their own local populations with a degree of international students, but not becoming hooked on international students like a drug as the be all and end all. And I think that the stats really bear this out. In the last 2 years, only a quarter of the increase in international students has come from the 24 Russell Group universities. The rest has come from universities which could be categorized as lower tier universities. And there are some very striking examples of universities which should be serving their domestic populations, but have ended up creating London campuses where almost all the courses are 1-year courses and almost all the students are international students. Now, you could say that will create some revenue which will subsidize courses for British students. Although I think the evidence suggests that that's a lot less than people think. But I don't think that's a healthy situation, because essentially those people are just buying a right to live in the UK for a period of time and may well be hoping that they never leave at all. And the second thing I'd say, Mark, is that the jobs that those students are going into are very far from the ones that I think Boris Johnson and the ministers who made these changes envisaged. Far from this being the best and the brightest who all go to university in the UK and then stay on and make a real contribution to the UK. In fact, a lot of people are going into very low paid, very low skilled jobs, such as being Deliveroo drivers. And I just think that's a bad thing for the country. And of course, those people do take up stocks of housing and access to public services and other things that cost us all money. And as I said earlier on, we live in a country with an extremely generous welfare state, and I just don't think you can have a welfare state like ours if you also have such free flows of immigration, whether that be students or for other areas.
Listen, Robert, I want to touch on a whole range of things beyond the immigration and asylum thing, but you mentioned at the top of the show Rwanda, and we do have a few questions more on the illegal immigration or the asylum side of the ledger, however you wish to describe it. What's wrong with the government's Rwanda plan? How skeptical are you about it? What needs to change for it to work? Do you think it's going to work in some way but only get halfway there? Or do you think it's going to be flattened by, I don't know, our membership of ECHR, for example? And we had a whole range of questions in the chat about this. And you may have seen, of course, the Northern Ireland decision today on not allowing, the Supreme Court's not going to allow people to be deported to Rwanda. So what was missing that led to your resignation over the Rwanda issue, and how do we fix it from a public policy point of view?
Well, I think the judgment this week in Northern Ireland simply confirms the argument that I've been making, that unless you can insulate this policy from the European Convention on Human Rights, either by leaving or by passing legislation that essentially derogates from it, you're going to find judges intervening and weakening it beyond all utility. And that I think is what is already starting to happen with this serious issue that's now arisen with respect to its applicability in Northern Ireland. But the broader question to me was, we're living in an age of mass migration. Illegal migration is going to be one of the biggest issues in not just British politics, but all Western countries for years to come. And so you have to create a proper, sustainable deterrent which will stop people from coming to our own shores. And the Rwanda policy could be that, but the version of it that the Prime Minister and the government have ultimately chosen to pursue is not that. It will lead to a small number of symbolic flights, but symbolic flights are not a deterrent. And so I think you will see flights going off to Rwanda later in the year, but the numbers of people coming into the country remaining very high. In fact, so far this year, they are at a record high and have undone the gains that we achieved last year when we had a 36% reduction.
So is the solution on this, Robert, that what we need to do is to leave ECHR, repeal the Human Rights Act, because we've sort of embedded the ECHR effectively into English law. And Nathan Aquera asks, do we need to go further than that on the judicial system? Should the role of Lord Chancellor be restored to what it was pre-Blair? Should we abolish the Supreme Court in its present form? So are you in favour now of we withdraw from ECHR, presumably we then repeal the Human Rights Act, perhaps replace it with some new British Bill of Rights? And what about this changing the judicial system as well, which sort of everybody sort of assumed when the Lord Chancellor was abolished, it was just sort of getting rid of a, ceremonial man in tights, but it seems to be a rather more important judicial feature than that. So what are the big building bricks that you'd alter to try and make these policies successful?
Well, on the Rwanda policy, my complaints were that it didn't remove the Human Rights Act, Tony Blair's Human Rights Act, which I think creates all sorts of difficulties for the successful creation of that policy. I think secondly, there will be a myriad of individual claims because the bill assumes good faith, and everything we know about illegal migration suggests that migrants and their lawyers will try every possible angle to frustrate their removal. And it doesn't remove the activism of the Strasbourg court. And so I think a better bill was possible, as though the government chose not to pursue that. But where do we go from here? I have come to the conclusion that we have to leave the European Court of Human Rights. I don't say that with any particular pleasure. I think the original document was a noble one, well-intentioned, but it's been twisted out of all shape by the activist judges and the apparatus that's built up around the court, which view it as a living instrument and have brought it into new aspects that Winston Churchill and its original authors could never have imagined. And it's not just illegal migration, incidentally, it's counterterrorism and our ability to monitor and survey people who are in this country who mean us harm. It's the ability to remove foreign national offenders to other countries. It's now entering areas like net zero, as we saw just
the government over Switzerland, Switzerland's environmental policy is, which I'd understood they voted for in a referendum, is now a matter for international human rights courts.
Exactly. I mean, that is a particularly egregious case where, exactly as you say, it's not even a matter of Swiss Parliament. It was a democratic referendum result, and it was a group of petitioners who weren't even able to prove that they had experienced any harm themselves, but they were arguing that they or their children and grandchildren might experience future harm. So that just shows that I'm afraid the court now are activist judges behaving as politicians rather than as a judiciary. And so I think we have to leave it. I don't think it is reformable. There are those who now adopt a comfort blanket of believing that the answer is to reform it. I don't think that's possible. I think it would be as doomed to failure as David Cameron's attempt to renegotiate our membership of the European Union. The interests of different member states are too divergent for a successful renegotiation, and it would be a project of years or decades in any case, during which time we will be living through this unprecedented period of illegal migration. And so I think we do have to leave it. I think there are other changes we could make alongside that. And I think there is an argument for reform of the Supreme Court and the role of the Lord Chancellor, exactly as you describe. But it's, I think, one step at a time, and the most important one is to leave the ECHR. And for those of us who believe that, to make the argument and to persuade the public, because I don't think that case is yet made with the public. And so we need to set out the argument and to win the argument as to why it's so important.
You touched on a little bit, and then we'll move on to some other subjects, Robert, the cultural impact of immigration as well, which is obviously much harder to distill into a bar graph or a line chart or data. But Jackie Gartside asks, why do the rights of illegal immigrants seem to trump the rights of British citizens? Hannah Walton Hughes asks, do you believe that multiculturalism, but specifically in relation to the integration of different cultures, has been a success overall in Britain? Or do you agree with Suella Braverman that it has failed? Beverly Stacey asks, can you please tell us how the government plans to keep British citizens safe, considering that the boat immigrants are now attacking civilians in places like Italy and France for just walking down the road? I'm frightened for the safety of Brits, says Beverly, especially considered we've voted a number of times to stop mass illegal immigration and been ignored spectacularly every time. That's an important point as well, isn't it? I mean, this comes up at every election. I think you can pretty much measure and intuit the desires of the British people, and nothing seems to change. In fact, the numbers go up and up and up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the democratic argument for action is just overwhelming, because for at least the last 30 years, political parties of all stripes have said that they believe in controlled and reduced migration, only in most cases to do precisely the opposite. And as a result of that, the public are extremely angry, frustrated, and it has massively corroded public trust in politics. In the report that we spoke about earlier, what I've advocated is not just a return to a target of tens of thousands, because we had that and didn't meet it in the past, but to have a democratic lock on that by Parliament voting for an overall cap. And I think that is workable. We've set out how you could do that in the report. But that would give the public at least some confidence that we're actually going to do this, and that we're not just another set of politicians making promises on migration only to break them. On your question about crime, I do think that's a concern. And it's something that...
So we're going to get the statistics on this, Robert. You're pressing for that, as I know GB News are campaigning on that.
Yeah, I've laid an amendment.
Stats.
It's going to be, I think, next week. It will come up with the Criminal Justice Bill, and we'll see whether the government agree to it or not. But I hope they do. I can't think of any good reason why they would refuse and essentially hide this information from the public. Let's be honest about what's happening. And I think that illegal migration is a national security emergency. That's how some other countries are viewing it. It's how I think the Republicans in the United States would view it. And we should be honest about that. It's an intolerable situation. But on the social and cultural question, I think just the scale and pace of immigration we've experienced in this country makes it impossible to successfully integrate and to build that sense of common purpose as a country. And that worries me. That's one of the reasons why I think we've got to get this under control. And I do think multiculturalism has failed, or at least not succeeded. And I don't think that is as shocking a statement as some people suggest. I just think that there are good things that come with diversity and immigration, but you cannot be blind to what is happening in this country, where you've got communities where people are leading essentially segregated lives, parallel lives to the rest of the population, and where people just do not appear to share what I consider to be British values. And we have to stand up against that. And there are a number of things you can do to challenge that, having a proper approach to integration, having a zero tolerance approach to extremism, ensuring the police are much more active and assertive in tackling it wherever they see it, revoking visas, which is something I started to do as immigration minister for people who are visiting the UK as students and so on, who are anti-Semitic or behave in a way which is clearly contrary to British values. But you do also have to just reduce and slow the pace of migration, because you can't build that integrated and cohesive society with the level of immigration that we've experienced in the last 10 years.
I'm wondering whether we can segue through what's happened on the immigration side to some other kind of core political topics. As you'll know, Robert, the key PopCon proposition is that we popular Conservatives worry that the institutional infrastructure of the United Kingdom is now in a whole range of areas so geared against conservatism that it doesn't necessarily mean that policy victories are impossible, but it does mean that they feel like an exercise in pushing water uphill. We're playing a football match, kicking uphill in both halves with only 8 men on the pitch and a biased referee and linesman. And that we need to sort of change that infrastructure that we've inherited from Blair. Alistair Hyde asks the question, to what extent is the civil service actually politicised in your view? Do you think it's just clickbait in the right-leaning media? How urgent is reform of the civil service? But it does seem that in a whole swathe of areas of our life, woke politics in particular, sort of what's taught in schools, the Climate Change Committee seems to me to have much more influence over environmental policy than the relevant Secretary of State. Aren't there a whole vast swathe of areas that after 14 years of Conservative government, we have to ask ourselves whether we actually didn't alter the rules of the game in the way that we should have done, because that might have led to considerably more policy success, rather than this sort of tearing our hair out that we don't seem to have made the progress that we would have liked to have made with, what, perhaps 6 months to go to a general election.
Yes, I tend to agree with you. I think that we failed to adequately address the apparatus that built up under the Blair and Brown era, whether that be some of the legal frameworks that arose during that period, like the Equalities Act, the ECHR, although obviously that predates that period, but the Human Rights Act brought it to the fore even more. And I think above all, this flourishing of quangos and so-called independent bodies, which are often far from that, and in fact just are staffed and populated by left-leaning individuals who want to pursue a different agenda to us, or at the very least just want to continue with the status quo rather than challenging things and trying to take the country in a different direction. I'm very worried about what would happen under a Labour government. I've written about this recently, that it feels to me as if Keir Starmer and the Labour Party will just continue that policy. They've already announced their intention to create dozens of new commissions and quangos and so on, all of which, of course, are entirely helpful to their political agenda, or make it even harder for a future government to push back. So I do think that the next Conservative government has to address this. And I've set out some of the things I would do, like leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, for example. But the second thing I'd say is that the state is weak in this country in some respects, and we've got to ensure that we have a civil service which is able to actually operationally deliver the things that need to be done. And I worry that that just isn't happening. And I've seen that in a number of different policy areas where we've wanted to do things, whether it's welfare reform, planning reform, serious supply side reforms of the kind that Liz Truss, for example, sought to push through. And obviously immigration is a very prominent one. And we've got to build a civil service which is smaller but higher caliber, with greater operational grip to be able to actually achieve these things. I've suggested for the Home Office, for example, that we split it up and create 2 different departments, one of which we build from the ground up with a much more robust
You'd split policing and border force, basically, that you'd have the control of the borders, immigration, asylum would be Department A, and Department B would be policing domestically. That's essentially that's
right. And the border one be one where the culture is all about actually tackling the problem rather than just the symptoms, because there's a massive misalignment of resources where billions of pounds and thousands of people are working on hotels and accommodating migrants, but comparatively few are upstream trying to break up the gangs, secure our borders, really stop the problem from happening in the first place. And too much emphasis is on, what they would consider to be customer service. How quickly can you wave people through the border, rather than how can you make sure that the borders are as robust and secure as possible.
For those of you watching, you might have seen we just put a poll up, which I should say only Robert and I, as the panelists here, are not allowed to vote on. But we asked whether people agreed that we should leave the ECHR, and a total of 96% of you either agree or strongly agree that we should leave the ECHR. I'm not suggesting that a PopCon webinar is entirely reflective of British public opinion. It's slightly self-selecting. But I'd also like to ask as well, because you mentioned the effect. I mean, we definitely got a big and bloated state, Robert, but you're quite right to suggest that doesn't necessarily mean it can do anything particularly effective. So I'd also like to ask people whether they actually think that whatever rules or public policies you might support, whether you're pro the Rwanda scheme or not, do you actually think we have an effective enforcement mechanism with regard to asylum and immigration? And that goes right the way through public policy elsewhere as well. On carbon net zero, I mentioned the Climate Change Committee. Do you think we should abandon that commitment, Robert? I mean, it seems to be uncosted, but insofar as we can work out the cost, utterly vast as a proportion of GDP and largely pointless, right? That even if we were to, and I've never understood why it's carbon net zero. I mean, why shouldn't we be carbon negative? Why have we worked out the exact number of CO2 molecules that need to be in the British atmosphere at 1 minute past midnight on the 1st of January 2050? Seems to me to be central planning gone bananas. Would you scrap that ambition and target?
Well, I think it was a very poorly thought through proposal back in the day. In fact, I was a Treasury Minister at the time, in the dying days of the Theresa May government, when in a desperate search for a legacy, the 2050 commitment was made and passed through Parliament with little, if any, debate. And I remember us as a group of ministers in the Treasury remarking that there'd been more consideration and debate about whether to ban plastic straws than to make this seismic change to our entire way of life and our economy. I think that you've got to think much more carefully about how you make these policy decisions. You've got to think about our energy security in the years and decades ahead. And we've established a department for net zero energy security, but these two things seem to be in direct conflict at times. And above all, we've got to think about our competitiveness as a country, because I don't want to get to net zero on the backs of small businesses, our industrial base, and our working and middle classes. And so we've got to think much more carefully about that. And exactly as you described, the UK is less than 1% of the world's emissions. And so the actions
and it's been falling rapidly
country,
anyway. It's been going down remarkably anyway. Yeah. I mean, green activists should be waving the union flag. We've got an absolutely fantastic record on environmentalism, not just CO2, the environmentalism more generally. Robert, I want to talk to you a bit about the prospects for the future for the Conservative Party, how the party should position itself. I think on most estimates, we're 6 months and a day from the general election. I think most estimates would be 14th of November is one of the favoured dates for that election. The local election and mayoral election results were pretty disappointing, very poor, let's be honest. By-election swings against the Conservatives of 25% or above now seem to be the norm. This is sometimes wished away by Conservatives by saying, well, that's what you get in midterm. I think 6 months from a general election is no longer midterm, right? And the opinion polls don't provide much succor either. What needs to change between now and polling day? I mean, I'm not even sure I can dare to hope the Conservatives might win the election, but at least to start to make it competitive. I mean, at the moment, it doesn't even look competitive. What's your advice on how we can turn that ship around?
Well, you're right. The situation is perilous. The election results were appalling. and they point to a very serious defeat for the party unless we can change course and use the precious time that we've got left to do as much as possible to persuade our voters that we have answers to the huge challenges facing the country. What I've tried to do is set out some things that we could do before the general election, which demonstrate that we are getting things done and that we have a truly conservative agenda. A lot of people I speak to on the doorstep don't think that the party is very conservative, and they want us to give them reasons to come out and support us. My suggestions to the Prime Minister have been a further significant intervention on legal migration, and we've set out a blueprint as to how to do that in the paper that we published last week. That we could go further on net zero pragmatism. There's been a welcome change of tone on that, led by the Prime Minister, but there are more significant things that one could do in that space to remove some of the more egregious targets and not to create new ones, which make life for businesses and individuals even more difficult. I've suggested interventions on housing as one of the key supply side reforms. And for example, there is a bill drafted and ready to go that would scrap largely pointless EU regulation on nutrient neutrality and unpause over 100,000 homes that could be built, creating thousands of jobs and a lot of economic growth. I think there's still time to do some more on tax. I suggested earlier in the year that the Chancellor could cut stamp duty, which I think would have boosted the economy significantly, created a feel-good factor, which is what we desperately need right now, and help exactly the right sorts of people, small business people, tradespeople, young people who are trying to get on the housing ladder. And I've also suggested that we take a much more robust approach on policing and extremism, which has concerned me a lot recently with the protests we've seen in London and elsewhere, and this emerging sense that there is two-tier policing in our country, which is intolerable and
what would you
should be standing up to.
What's your solution to that? That seems to be the lived experience, if you like. Nicholas Lewis asked, what are your thoughts on the current Palestinian process at UK university? What should the approach be taken by the government? Should it be more heavy-handed than it currently is? What's the magic bullet here? What's the solution on extremism? And you haven't yet mentioned also another issue that might go into the Conservative Party manifesto: defence. We're in a pretty perilous world. I think the Americans are getting rather unsympathetic, not so much with the UK, but a good number of other NATO members who are not paying their way in what we're told is an incredibly dangerous and perilous world. Defence spending seems to be on the back burner.
Well, on policing, I want the police to enforce our existing laws. I don't think that you necessarily need to change the law, although there's always ways in which you can improve them. But you just got to have a zero tolerance approach. I think it's completely outrageous that the police don't step in and arrest somebody who is shouting Allah Akbar on the streets of the West End, or those people who are projecting genocidal chants on to Big Ben, or even on a much smaller scale, someone who slashes a painting at Trinity College, Cambridge, and then walks off out of the college premises without even being arrested. There is a growing sense of impunity, which is very worrying and concerning, and we've got to fight back against that and ask the police to step up. On defence, I want to see us increase defence spending to at least 3% of GDP. I don't think that you can make an argument like the Prime Minister did today that we are living in a period of unprecedented danger and then have a slow plan to ramp up defence spending over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. If we are living in a period of such danger, and I think that we are, you've got to act now and increase defence spending immediately. I would do that in part by reducing our international aid budget and taking that and putting it at the disposal of the armed forces immediately. At least a third of our defence spend, of our international aid budget today, is spent on economic development projects of dubious utility. I think they could be scrapped and that money spent immediately on defence. And the UK should view its role in the world as supporting defence and security through our world-class armed forces rather than through pursuing these misguided international development projects. I think with hindsight, it was a mistake for David Cameron to double the international aid budget whilst reducing our defence budget.
Yeah.
We should
Are
now,
you
we should
attracted,
now
Robert?
correct that.
Are you attracted though to these percentages? I get a bit worried that we're going to go down a route where we spend, I don't know, 3% on defence, 0.7% on international aid, 0.01% on refuse collection. Seems to me on defence, we just need to spend what we need to spend. Our defence requirements don't necessarily halve if GDP halves, nor do they necessarily double if GDP doubles. We just need to work out what the total quantum of stuff we need to buy, or the amount of money we need to spend, irrespective of GDP. No.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is a very crude way of looking at very serious issues. I don't like the idea that governments set arbitrary targets. I certainly don't like the idea of government setting arbitrary targets in law, like net zero 2050, which are easy to do at the time and then leave future generations to pick up the bill and work out how they're done. And I think with defence spending, it's obviously critical that we improve the way in which this money is spent, because procurement is terrible. There's a lot of waste in the Ministry of Defence, and it doesn't feel to me as if we've gripped that in recent years.
I just want to finish, I suppose, with the future of the Conservative Party. You intimate it, Robert, that sort of people on the doorstep who you might normally put in the Conservative column don't really consider the Conservative Party to be sufficiently conservative. The more I've done this job of the director of PopCon, the more I've noticed a yawning gap, really, between the Conservative Parliamentary Party and the Conservative Party membership. Andy Beckett, his question's been at the top of the list for a while. I'm interested in Robert's views on the party structure and central office. What reform would he like to see to deal with the ideological difference between members and voters and the parliamentary party, i.e. how should candidates be selected? Who should choose the leader? There was another question about, I think, referring to some of Graham Bethell. Do you support the recent idea supposedly made by Sir Graham Brady, the chair of the 1922 committee, that party members should be removed from the process of selecting future leaders? Or do you agree with me, with Graham, and most, if not all party members, that members must have the final say on selecting new leaders? And of course, a couple of people have inevitably asked the question whether you're satisfied with the present leadership. Claire Bullivant from CDO asks, have you submitted your letter of no confidence in the Prime Minister yet? Will you? Do you really think we can win if the Prime Minister stays at the home? If there's a leadership contest, will you run? Well, there will be a leadership contest at some point. Rishi Sunak's not going to be leader of the Conservative Party forever. So what are your views on the structure of the Conservative Party going forward? I mean, its membership has generally declined over the decades, but if party members don't feel that they're empowered, then it's a little difficult to persuade them to hand over their membership subscription. Beverly Stacey makes the same point. Why aren't the Conservatives actually conservative anymore? We need grassroots conservatism. There's a huge appetite for this. Look at the support for Reform UK since the Conservatives have shunned conservatism and inched ever further towards socialist policy. What are your thoughts on that, the longer-term future of the party, Robert?
Well, when I resigned from cabinet, there were, you lose things when you do that. You lose your job, and you have difficult conversations with friends and colleagues. But I think the thing that I've gained is the ability to look people in the eye and speak honestly about the situation that we find ourselves in as a party and as a country, and in particular to voice the very clear concern of many members of the party about the direction that we've taken in recent years. And I think there is a yearning in the party and indeed in the country for the Conservative Party to just be more conservative and to be the party that stands up for secure borders, lower legal migration, lower taxes, small business, the family, all the things that drove me to be a conservative when I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, when I joined the party in the immediate aftermath of 97 at a low point back then. That is what I want the party to recapture. And I think if we can do that and articulate a positive vision for conservatism that is authentically conservative, then there is a bright future for the Conservative Party. And we saw in 2019 that there has been a realignment of British politics, and we should be continuing to reach out to those voters that we secured back then in the towns and the cities of the Midlands and the North, where I grew up and I represent, and many places across the UK that are very similar, and not chasing policies which are so similar to those of our opponents. And so my advice to the Conservative Party now and in the future will be to find an authentic conservative voice and inspire people, because I think the public are yearning for that. There is an appetite for that. We saw that in 2019. I think we can recapture that again in the future.
And is it too late to affect the next general elections, you think? I mean, there would need to be a monumental turnaround in the polls. William and Quolo, sorry if I've murdered your surname there, William, says he's worried we've already given up. We didn't take the London mayoral election seriously. Sadiq Khan was there for the taking. Is the next election already beyond us, or is there still time to turn it around?
Well, the polls are very bad, but nothing is ever written. And we have to fight for every vote. I mean, we're in the fight for our lives, because at the moment, this could be one of the worst election results in the modern history of the party. And so we have to go out and attempt to win as many seats as we possibly can. I'm going to use the time remaining before the general election to make arguments, to push the government to use the precious time that we've got remaining to do conservative things, which will hopefully encourage conservative voters to come out and vote, persuade some of those people who are thinking of voting reform to come back to us, and to support as many of our candidates as possible, particularly those who share our vision for the future of the Conservative Party, to help them get re-elected so they can be part of what comes next.
Robert, we've overrun our time. It's been a great pleasure. We've covered, well, everything: carbon net zero, defence, policing, the bureaucratic structure, the future of the party. Thanks so much for spending an hour with us. You can see from the reaction that we're receiving from those online the level of support I think that there is for these ideas amongst the Conservative Party membership. It's been absolutely terrific. Thanks to all of you who joined this online pop conversation. We've got a few more lined up. I'm not quite ready to advertise them yet. I was hoping I might have the final details today, but please join us for future. We've got some great speakers lined up for the coming weeks. But to hear about that, make sure you either visit our website, popularconservatism.com, and sign up to the PopCon newsletter. The details for that are in the chat, so you'll be getting those whizzing over to you in the next few days. I think this is a great way of engaging with the grassroots of the party. But Robert, my greatest thanks goes to you for giving over an hour of your time in what I know is a hectically busy schedule, for sharing your thoughts on where we go from here and what needs to change. And I did the best I could to play devil's advocate, but I think I agree with virtually all of them. So Robert, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll see you again for another Pop Conversation very soon. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Over and out.